Okay. Well, thanks for having me today, to Jenny and to Greg. It's great to be back at the Advanced Liberty and Society. I actually did this myself 6 years ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it was October 2008, just as the financial system was about to collapse, actually. So it was a very exciting time. And I also did the more junior LNS back in 2004 as well. So I hope you're having a great weekend. I should start out by saying it's wonderful to hear all of the achievements of David. It's certainly true. He's not just big noting himself. People in the press gallery have noticed this as well. Indeed, I had one senior journalist just this week, actually. I was in Canberra, came up to me and said, "Oh, he's really sharp, that one," talking about David. And he said, "Not like all the other buffheads." So the benchmark's not necessarily too high in the Senate. There are a lot of buffheads, but some sharp ones as well. So what will I talk about? And I'll try to keep the remarks fairly short so we can have a robust exchange later. Well, firstly, I want to explain why I think there's been a modest revival in classical liberalism in Australia. So there's some reasons for that. And then I'll talk about some of the threats to it. And then finally, I'll talk about three challenges, I think, anyway, will be and are challenges to classical liberal thought in the policy area. So firstly, if I just start out by saying that we've had this political fragmentation on the left of politics, if you like, for quite some time now. If you go back 20 or 30 years, you'll see that the primary vote of the Greens would have been about 5%, and I think this week in the news poll it was about 12%. So that is a very dramatic change on the left, and of course it is making it harder and harder for the Labor Party, which once certainly commanded the largest share of the primary vote. I mean, it had historically been a very powerful force in Australian politics. Indeed, you could argue that the Liberal Party was really a response to the Labor Party. It was a desire for the anti-Labor parties to win back government. Of course, now you could make various disparaging remarks about what the Labor Party stands for. I mean, I think it's very sad that it doesn't really seem to stand for much except for winning office. Although you can probably say that to some extent about the Liberal Party as well. Anyway, so they're often both as bad as one another. But we haven't seen this fragmentation on the right yet, and I really hope that it is starting to occur here. And I think we're already seeing it with the election of senators like David and also Bob Day. And you mentioned a few sympathetic Liberal senators. That's certainly true. People like Dean Smith, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's also a Libertarian. Scott Ryan from Victoria is as well. So historically, though, the Libertarian wing of the Liberal Party has not been very powerful. Indeed, the famous Liberal Bert Kelly kind of routinely lambasted his own colleagues in the press for being so weak and for being so socialist. There are fantastic paragraphs from his columns that basically say the Liberal Party has been far more of a force for socialism in this country than the Labor Party has. And there are many instances where that is true. Indeed, if you think of all the great social reforms, the Liberal Party simply agrees after a while. And then they introduce their own on top of that. So I don't think that they have been a very effective counterpoint to expansions of government spending. Now, three reasons. Well, firstly, I mean, for classical liberalism, you could not have had a better public relations event than the global financial crisis. Now, I know this is 6 years ago, but it really did force everyone to reevaluate government policy, and in particular its interaction with the banking sector, whether the incentives were right, whether regulations were right. I mean, in the decade or so leading up to 2008, I mean, the economies around the world, which countries I'm talking about, like Australia, were really chugging along very well. Everyone's real wages were rising. Of course, the real wages at the very top of the income spectrum were going up very fast, especially in the finance sector. But nevertheless, the vast bulk of the population, living standards were improving every year, and so everyone thought that everything was very hunky-dory. Of course, there was a massive economic crisis. Australia was largely insulated, and there are various reasons for that. But certainly, it really hit the world. And I think in the US, in particular, there was a dramatic revival in libertarian thought. Of course, with Ron Paul running for president, and I think ending up attracting 7% of the vote, or something like that, or 5 or 7%, which is very significant, given it would have been about zero a few decades earlier. And we can only hope that similar levels of primary support will flow to senators like David in the future, and we can have more senators of that inclination in the Australian Senate. So look, that is the first factor. The second factor, I think, is just, and this is quite aside from the global financial crisis, it's just that government in rich countries has basically grown to be very, very large and to be very, very costly. And I think this is kind of undermining or promoting support for more classical liberal thought. Now, there's a trend. I mean, in the press, it is very common to refer to ratios of government spending to GDP to discuss how large government is. And sure, that's fine. And if you do that in Australia, you'll get about 25 or 27% for the federal government and about another 13 or so for the states and local government. So it's about 40%. Lower than Europe. We always like to say, the Labor Party always like to say in government, oh look, we have a very small government here because in Europe it's 50% and so forth. In France, actually, it's now 55%. So there's more of the country's national income is spent by the government than by its private citizens, which really is quite astonishing. So even in Australia, government spending has gone from roughly 5% about a century ago to about 40% now. I think one of the great ironies of this is if you ask someone on the street, what sort of society do we live in? Is it a free society? Is it a capitalist society? They'll say, oh yeah, free markets, etc. Well, actually, government has never been larger in the history of the world. So I don't know what they thought it was 100 years ago, but it was a lot freer then, and government was a lot smaller. So it's increasingly hard to make the case that we are living in a free market society. I just wanted to say, just on the habit of always referring to spending, it's very important, I think, to think about regulations too. I mean, the Parliament, I think, in the last term of the Gillard government was churning out something like 12,000 pages of legislation every year or something like this. I mean, it's quite astonishing kind of amount of new regulations, and sure, lots of them are very arcane bits of tax law and so forth. But still, it is kind of adding, in my view, unnecessarily to the complexity of society and so forth. And regulations, they all create great costs too. I mean, the number one is probably the superannuation system. I mean, that is a regulation, just one regulation. But of course, it does divert 9.5% of everyone's income into an account. So that actually, by the way, is one of the reasons why Australia's spending to GDP is so much lower than in Europe, because in Europe, all of that age pension spending, if you like, is kind of on balance sheet. It's actually, the government's actually doing it. They're taxing people and then they're paying it back to them in retirement benefits. So of course it shows up as government expenditure. Whereas our huge superannuation system does not actually show up as a government expenditure, but you could certainly make the case that it basically is. It's just kind of doing it in another way, right? And actually, I might add, an extremely costly way too. So the third reason why I think that there's a revival in classical liberal thought is because of changing technology. So we're seeing with things like apps, with the internet. This is almost a cliche, but it is so much easier to get information now oneself, and you don't have to rely on the bureaucracy to tell us things as much anymore. And I mean, even things like in health, in education, we can kind of learn things ourselves. The dramatic improvement in communication means that people can organise things themselves online. They don't need to go via formal institutions to do so. And I think that this is a really powerful force. Indeed, things like taxis. With the new app Uber. I mean, it is still the case in Victoria and South Australia that drivers of Uber cars are being fined $1,700 simply for doing that. And at the moment, of course, Uber actually pays those fees. But I mean, it is a dramatic example of an unjustified government incursion. And I was just reading this morning that there's a lady in Randwick, and she's been renting out one of her rooms through Airbnb, and she's been sent a letter by the council saying that she's going to be fined $1.1 million because she's running an unauthorised bed and breakfast. Quite astonishing stuff, really. I mean, but anyway, so they are the three reasons. Now, working against all that is the so-called war on terror, and I think this factor may indeed overwhelm the other three. I mean, I don't mean to be pessimistic, but we're seeing in Australia, of course, now everyone's kind of hysterical about terrorism, and not just Australia, but the US and Europe, and of course there are justified fears, but those justified fears are of course leading to a dramatic increase in the power of the state. We're seeing legislation now go through the Parliament that will significantly increase the powers of ASIO, etc. It's worth noting that there was a very, very significant increase in the level of expenditure on Australia's security services in the wake of the 2001 a tax in the US, something like 40%. Then there was a review and there was a massive increase. And then in 2004, there was a formal inquiry, and I think it was headed up by Philip Flood, who was the former head of DFAT. And he basically concluded that levels of spending were just about right. That's, they've got the new powers, it's all just about right. We can't really foresee that we need more. Anyway, since then, the spending on the 6 kind of security services, such as ASIO, ASIS, the Office of National Assessments, etc., there's a few others as well, has grown by a compound annual rate of about 11% every single year. So far, far faster than age pension and health and all this other stuff. Sure, from a lower base, but still extraordinarily fast spending. And of course now, the government wants to throw another $630 million at it. This is a government, of course, that has in the past claimed a budget emergency. But no, there's a spare 630 mil over 4 years, that's just over 4 years, for the security services. And as far as I know, that amount of spending is embedded in these bills, which are currently going through the Senate. So, this is a real concern. I mean, we had a tightening of laws in 2004. The ASIO Act was tightened, and then in 2005 there was a new piece of legislation called the Anti-Terrorism Act, I think, which actually was used last week in the raids in Sydney and Brisbane for the first time, the powers in that act. And yet, no, they still need more and more and more. So, and sadly, they will probably get it, I think. But where does it stop? I mean, there'll be another terror incident in 5 years, more legislation. And then another 5 years, more legislation. I mean, when will the point come where we all have to wear little, chattels around our ankles so government knows exactly where we are at all times? And of course, they'd say, oh, but we're not going to use it to spy on people. We just want to know because it's going to improve safety. And, who can argue against safety? Now, the 3 challenges, I think, and I don't know how much time I have. Firstly, I think one of the big challenges for classical liberal thought is the hollowing out of the labour market in rich countries. Now, I don't know, maybe this sounds a little bit lefty, but so Keynes wrote a famous essay about 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago, I think 1930 it was, of the economic consequences. The future for our grandchildren, or something like that. And in that, he said that it'd be wonderful in 100 years because there'd be massive unemployment. And he thought this was a wonderful thing because we'd be very, very rich, and there'd be amazing technology, and so all of the rudimentary jobs that low-income people did would be done by machines, and effectively kind of pricing all of the low-skilled labour out of the market, the vast, vast bulk of the labour force out of the market, and only the very smart people would actually have jobs because they would be needed to run the society. Everyone else, he thought, would go to art galleries and have a wonderful time. Now, this is, of course, very naive in the sense that what people would want to do with their spare time, but I think that his prediction is slowly, gradually coming true in rich countries. I mean, the measured unemployment rate in Australia is 6.2 or something. The US, it's about the same, but I mean, the real level of unemployment is vastly, vastly higher than that, right? I mean, you only have to work 1 hour in a single week to be classified as employed, right? Just 1 hour. And if you look at the rate of underemployment, it's been growing extremely quickly. Since 1978, it's actually tripled. And for a column about 6 months ago, I thought, well, what share of the population is actually not in a job? And it's 49%. So I said the unemployment rate is 49%. Everyone's like, what? And of course that includes children and old people and everything. But still, I mean, it's quite astonishing to think that, basically half the population does not work. Now, of course, if you go back a couple of hundred years, it would have been 100% of the population were working. And that's because we were poor and because basically everyone had to work. So it is, partly a good thing that there is unemployment because we are rich, and so lots of people don't need to work. We can support people with pensions and so forth. So that's a good thing. But then on the other hand, how do we pay for all this? And is it right just to tax the wealthy to support people? But if those people can't get jobs, well, what do you do? I mean, I don't have the answers. I'm just saying I think this is a real problem, and not just in Australia. I think we've been insulated by the resource boom from this problem to some extent, but I think it's really going to come to the fore over the next few decades, especially since we have such high minimum wages. So we're kind of, exacerbating the situation by pricing our low-skilled labour completely out of the global market. That's one problem. The second one is banking. What do we do about banks? So, I mentioned the GFC earlier, and this basically illustrated that, just because a company is private, as most banks are, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily completely removed from the impact of government policies. I mean, the issue of implicit guarantees, in my view, was the formative reason why we had the global financial crisis, and this is basically that banks, or more correctly, people that lend to banks know very well that they will get their money back. And so therefore they are willing to lend to banks at far lower interest rates than they would lend to them if they actually had a real risk of losing their money. And that is because the banks are very large, and they know that regardless of what a politician says, that at the end of the day, if they fail, they will be bailed out. At least their liability side will be bailed out. And that's been a fantastic situation for the finance sector because it's enabled it to grow very, very large. And if you look at the finance sector as a share of economies in rich countries, I mean, it's almost doubled in about 40 years. So, I mean, you should ask yourself, why is this sort of intermediary, which is all it is, it's kind of a middleman industry, why is it so large? Why is it growing faster than, or at least it was, faster than any other sector? Now, traditionally, I think a lot of people on the right said, oh, well, it's just no government regulation and so forth. But I think that that's a bit simple. I think because of this complicated problem of a moral hazard, I really think that you do have to, through regulation, as a kind of second best situation. Of course, first best situation, to use a bit of economics jargon, is that the government actually lets these things fail. But that is not going to happen. It's just not going to happen, right? So what is the second best then? Well, then I think you have to massively lower their leverage by regulation, very, very significantly. I mean, currently all the major banks are leveraged about 22 times, right? This is huge historically, huge. If you go back through history 100 years, most banks were leveraged about 6 or 7 times. Now they're leveraged 23 times. So that basically means that their money, or the shareholders' money, is only about 5% of the value of their assets. So if the value of their assets on average falls by 5%, then it kind of wipes out shareholders and they're insolvent, right? Now, obviously being extremely leveraged is great for your rate of return, it's great for bank management, it's great for remuneration, all this sort of stuff, but it's not necessarily good for taxpayers in the long run. So that's the second issue. The third issue I just wanted to talk about is tax reform. So most kind of sensible economists on the right always say, oh look, we need to increase the GST and we need to broaden the base and then we can cut income tax. I'm like, well yes, I mean in theory that is all good, that would be good, but in practice that is not what happens. I mean, we see all around the world that once the rate of a consumption tax is increased, it will be increased again and again and again. So I think the political obsession that we have in this country, that it remain at 10%, and thank God still both sides of politics are kind of wedded to that, although I do worry that it's going to break in the next few years and one side or the other will come out and say we need to lift the GST. So I think the GST was invented by France, fittingly, of course, called something else, I think in 1956, at a very low rate of 4% or 6% or something like that, and now it's about 22%. It's been increased dramatically over that period. Same in the UK. I think Thatcher introduced it 7.5% or 10%. What is it now? I think it's 20 or 19. So it is an extremely easy tax to increase. This is the problem with consumption taxes. Yes, in theory they are efficient, but they are extremely easy to increase because you don't see that you're paying it. I mean, sure, it's on the bill, but no one looks at the bill, right? If you go to a restaurant, you don't say, oh, I paid such and such in GST. No one looks at that. But they are paying tax. So it's a fantastic tax for big government. Fantastic tax. So just always remember that in theory it's great and you can cut income tax, but in practice it's a really, really terrible tax. And just in the case of Australia, when it was introduced, the main marginal tax rate that most workers were paying was 34%. And of course, as part of the deal, it was lowered to 30%, and then we had a GST. So that was kind of the situation. Anyway, we fast forward to now, 15 years later, almost, and we still have the GST, of course. Indeed, people are wanting to extend it and increase it. What is the average, so what is the marginal rate of tax that most workers are paying? Is it 34? No, 34.5 now. And in fact, it's about to be 39% because we haven't had any return of bracket creep for such a long time that the average wage over the next few years is going to go above, going to rise above $80,000. And so therefore, you'll have the most commonly paid marginal tax rate will be 39%. So, kind of scary stuff, right? So that is the last issue. I just want to briefly comment on the media. I was also asked to talk about this. So what's happening in the media? Well, you've probably read in the press that newspapers are under a lot of financial pressure, and that is obviously true. So what's the economics of that? What does that mean for what's in the newspapers? Well, obviously, quite aside for obvious things like they had to cut a lot of journalists and so forth. The massive slump in advertising revenue has meant that your newspapers are a lot more concerned about what readers think and what they want to read than they were in the past. I mean, back in the glory days of the 80s, when you had the Rivers of Gold and the Sydney Morning Herald, the editors they don't really care what the readers think, because they had so much revenue from advertising that it really didn't matter. So to some extent that was good and bad. It meant that the editors could kind of give people what they thought they should be reading as opposed to what they wanted to read. But I think now you're seeing a polarisation in the press in Australia, where you've got some newspapers that are kind of aggressively on one side and then other newspapers that are aggressively on the other side. And they're doing that not because they are intrinsically like that, but because it just makes financial sense that you need to have an audience, and you need to have an audience that wants to pay. And so people generally prefer to read opinion than a news, especially when the news is available for free on the ABC. So, but it's a whole other issue. And so I think it's to some extent concerning that media outlets are being pressured into being more shrill than they would have been in the past. But I don't know how to resolve the situation. Again, it's another challenge. I just hope the industry finds a new equilibrium and that advertising revenue stops falling. Okay. Anyway, so I'll conclude there, and hopefully we can have a good discussion.